Do you sometimes think we're on the edge of an apocalypse? That tomorrow you might wake up to a barren and dog-eat-dog wasteland of mass destruction? And I'm not talking about America after the election. Sounds like it's time for episode 31 of Pop Art, the podcast where my guest chooses a movie from popular culture and also look to film from the more art classic side of cinema with a connection to it. I am your I live, I die, I live again host, Howard Kastner. For my listeners, please like, follow, or comment. I'm especially looking for more reviews on iTunes, and I'd love to know what you think. Today, I am happy to welcome back a previous guest, the host of the Cathode Ray Mission, Adam Ferenz, who has chosen George Miller's blockbuster reimagining of the George Miller franchise Mad Max Fury Road. And I have chosen L.Q. Jones' cult classic adaptation of enfant terrible sci-fi author Harlan Ellison's cult classic, A Boy and His Dog. Two apocalyptic films about some very strange strangers in some very strange lands. To begin, Adam, why don't you tell us all something about yourself?
I am trained as an historian and a culturalist, a fair bit of social history and literary and writing theory thrown in. I'm currently writing a book on the top 300 TV programs from around the world, working on figuring out great new episodes for my own show.
Which is the Cathode Ray Mission, right?
Yep. I have a new episode coming up next week that's one I've been looking forward to do for a long time. It just took a long time to find the right guest for it.
Great. Well, with that, let's get to your selection, Mad Max Fury Road. First, some information about the film. Mad Max Fury Road is an Australian film that was released in 2015. It was directed by George Miller and written by Miller, Brendan McCarthy, and Nico Lathoris. It stars Tom Hardy, Charlize Theron, Nicholas Hoult, and Hugh Keys-Byrne. The basic premise revolves around Max Rokitansky, or Mad Max, a nomad loner wandering a post-apocalyptic world, left a barren wasteland after a series of wars, first over oil and then over water. He is taken prisoner by the fascistic dictator of an oasis called the Citadel, which has a source of water. But he reluctantly joins with the dictator's best warrior driver, who goes rogue and tries to lead the dictator's pregnant concubines to a place of safety. Why did you choose this film?
Two reasons. One, my initial choice turns out to have already been done, and that was Raiders of the Lost Ark. Second, I think that this film is probably the second greatest action film of its kind next to Raiders of the Lost Ark, which I hold in very, very high regard. In my run-up to this episode, I finally got around to seeing the black and chrome edition, which I have to say, I don't agree with Miller that it's the definitive version of the film, but it certainly is a striking way to take in the work.
What is different about the black and chrome edition?
Other than being in black and white, it's the way the color timing is. A lot of people joked, well, you could just turn the color off on your TV and have a black and white edition, but it's the way that they went in and managed the black and white, because the film, as we know, is so visually splendid in terms of its use of color. This is a different experience. I mean, I prefer the color. I prefer those lush reds, oranges, the little hint of green we get in one sequence, the blues of the sky. It's a magnificent work of art, really. As big a hit as it was, this is also a film that is every bit a work of art as any other action film ever has been. I'd rank it up there, as I said, with Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I know some people consider Seven Samurai an action film. I don't, but if you want to consider that an action film, then hell yeah, it's right up there with that as well.
When did you first see the film?
I want to say it was opening weekend, but I can't remember if I saw it the second or the third day. I know that I had been curious about it. The Mad Max franchise was one that I liked without really loving. Some people whose opinion I trusted, some friends of mine, they'd managed to see previews of the film. They were like, no, this is a really special movie and it's right up your alley. And I'm like, well, maybe I'll take a look at it. I saw it, then I went back a few days later and saw it a second time, having dragged someone else. Then I went back a third time a few weeks later. I bought it on Blu-ray. I've probably seen the film a dozen times. It's amazing.
What did you think upon first seeing it? You've spoken some of that, but what were your first impressions?
Well, my first impression was that I've rarely seen a film that does such a good job with a minimal of dialogue, yet retains pretty fully fleshed out characters and motivations with a fun little story and plot such as it is. You never lose track of the action, what's going on. This is a film that, of course, is mostly practical effects, which is, again, extraordinary. A lot of the film comes together in the editing. This is just classic movie making and really proves that you don't need, even though it helps, you don't need $200 million worth of computerized effects to make an amazing experience.
Speaking to the dialogue, I believe there are only 52 lines of dialogue in the whole film, including the opening voiceover.
I'm not sure if that's for the whole film or if that's for Max, because Max is a man of very few words in this movie. Really amazing how little is actually said, and yet you know everything. And that's really a testament to Miller and his crew. They did a superb job with the design. Not looking at it right now, but I believe it won 6 or 7 Oscars, including, I think, for makeup, sets, maybe for costumes that year. This is a movie that has a whole world of visual information creating an entire world. People talk about things like Blade Runner, 2001, and in terms of world building, I think this is right up there with that for what they accomplished. Without those efforts, it would just be the cinema's longest chase sequence.
When I saw it, I also saw it probably around the same time you did when it first came out. I don't know exactly. I'm sure it was the first week, but I don't know if it was opening day. And I suppose I should go for full disclosure here. I think that it's technically brilliant, but I am not a big fan of the movie myself. And I think you just said why. For me, it's just one long chase scene. And that's about all it is. They go to one place, and when they get there, they come back. So in full disclosure, I should just say that's sort of where I am at with the movie myself. But I do agree that technically it is incredible. Miller has said, yes, 90% of the effects were practical. And I don't think anybody got hurt or seriously hurt. I think Tom Hardy did get his nose broken when Charlize Theron accidentally hit him with her prosthetic arm.
They actually have footage of that happening, and you can see how embarrassed and concerned she is. But Hardy, despite the broken nose, is kind of like laughing and saying, "You sure you don't need me to get you in touch with a trainer? That's a hell of a hook you've got."
Apparently one of the few times they got along. I guess a rumor has it.
That's the thing. I'm thinking to myself, wait, didn't they not get along on the set? But I think that must have been one of those days where maybe they both had a good meal or they were in a good mood. They were talking about turning this into a new trilogy, and an unusual trilogy where what we're going to get is a set of films focusing less on Max than on Furiosa. The new film that's been announced is a young Furiosa, and I believe the actress, again, without checking, the rumor was they were going to have Anna Taylor-Joy as young Furiosa.
And there was some controversy over that, wasn't there, because they weren't casting Charlize Theron.
But the thing is if you're going to have a young Furiosa, a girl who's supposed to be in her late teens to early 20s, you can't have Charlize Theron as talented and lovely as she remains, a woman who's, what is she? She's approaching 50 now?
I think so. You would never know it, but yes.
No, you'd never know it.
But yes.
But,
I also think that the Tom Hardy sequel to it is listed on his IMDb page as in pre-production. When it comes to the idea of there being a lot of tension on the set and people not getting along, part of it was because both Theron and Miller, I think, considered Tom Hardy a bit difficult to work with. But at the same time, there was tension among all of them because I believe both Hardy and Theron had absolutely no understanding of what Miller was trying to do here.
Right.
And it wasn't until they saw the finished film, and then Tom Hardy apologized at Cannes, made a big speech about just not having any idea what Miller was trying to do. I think at one point Charlize Theron said, "Do you even know what's going on here? Do you have any idea what you're doing?"
The only person on the set that told them, well, you should trust him was Hugh Keys-Byrne. But Hugh Keys-Byrne, of course, had worked with Miller before on a couple of other films, so he knew to trust in Miller's vision.
He was in the last Mad Max film. He was Toe Cutter.
He was Toe Cutter in the very first one, and I think he also had a voice role in Happy Feet. I believe he was in Babe Pig in the City, but don't quote me on that.
Yeah, you heard it here first, folks. What are some of your favorite scenes from the movie?
I really do love the chase into the storm, what happens immediately after. I really love the quiet section from when they find what turns out to be the green place, and they meet the women who are a little further out than that, and they find out they've already passed through it and it's become a wasteland, this paradise they're looking for. Then, of course, the way that it all comes together at the end. For me, the way that all the storylines and the plot lines and the character developments are resolved in those final 15 minutes or so of action, it's very, very fitting and very satisfying for me. The Nicholas Hoult character, a character that could have ended up very annoying. His sacrifice ends up being the emotional catharsis for the film for me.
He is, for me, the one character that actually earns the most empathy, that you are most sad about in his passing. It's about the only one that has any change or character development.
No, I was a huge supporter of this film during the Oscars. It was my #1 film of the year. Now, was I happy that Spotlight won? Oh, yeah. I thought Spotlight was a very deserving film. There were a few other films that year that I thought were a little more deserving, including this one. Not including the DiCaprio film, The Revenant. I liked it. I just didn't think it was a top 5 movie that year. This film, and it stuck with me over the last 5 years. When I watched it the other night, that was the first time I'd seen it in about a year or so. As I said, the first time for the black and chrome edition. But despite the lack of color, all the action, all the developments, they're still there. I give very high marks to anyone that still understands that film is a visual medium. As important as a great script is, as important as good dialogue can be, if you can't tell your film visually, if there's not information up there on the screen, you might as well be looking at a painting. And there's nothing wrong with a painting, but a painting and a movie are by their very nature 2 different things.
I suppose, and my response would be that film is both visual and oral, that each film has to find its own balance of that.
Oh, yeah.
And that a movie can be too visual or it can be too oral. And it just from movie to movie. I guess I don't basically agree with the idea that movies are essentially a visual medium. I think they're a compound of a number of mediums, and that's what makes them special.
Yeah, and I may have overstated a little bit, but that may also be that I keep forgetting about atrocious things like Moulin Rouge and Baz Luhrmann or Michael Bay, forgetting that, yeah, it's a visual medium, but it doesn't mean a darn thing if you don't have a solid script. Again, you don't have to have great dialogue, but you need to have a good story. You need to have good characters. You can have a film that's, say, 85 minutes long that has maybe 15 minutes worth of dialogue that isn't very action-packed and yet is still a great movie because you understand everything that's going on.
But have you seen the movie The Thief with Ray Milland?
Oh, God, a long time ago.
Well, The Thief has absolutely no dialogue, nothing. And it is one of the most annoying films I've ever seen in my life because there is no dialogue.
Yeah.
It just depends on the film. It varies from film to film. I certainly agree with you that the movie is stunning from a technical aspect. It's stunning visually. It shows an incredible amount of imagination. One of my favorite characters or scenes has to be, his name is Iota. I think the character is called the Doof or something like that. He's the guitar player.
Yeah.
And that takes a lot of a fevered imagination, sort of a madman's imagination. I know, let's put this rock guitar player on the front of a truck and play this electric guitar to amp up everybody. Sure, why not?
Yeah.
It's very much a comic book movie in many ways. It did start out as storyboard. I mean, it was all storyboarded, I guess, within an inch of its death before they began shooting the movie. So I don't know how else she could possibly do it.
Yeah, I'm sure even Spielberg might have pulled on his beard and gone, well, damn, George.
What did you think of the ending?
Thought that the ending was good. And there's that nice quote, I can't remember it right now, but I think that it's very fitting that they use it, at least in the black and white version. And like I said, I liked it. I liked the fact that Max just knew enough to go back into the crowd, to go back to the people, to go back to his life wandering. Furiosa and the women had the city. They had the Citadel. That was their business. That was their civilization, but it wasn't his.
The main issue I had with the ending, and this was my response when I saw the movie, is when she opens the water gates. And the audience was thrilled. But I'm going, are you insane? Water is a finite resource. You can't just open these water gates and let them flow. I'm going, the previous guy was a fascistic dictator, but at least he knew enough not to waste the water. So I had this very weird...
I actually, now that you're talking about that aspect of it, that part of the ending did get me. That is something that, now that you bring it up, that is the one problem that I might have within the story that I thought, yeah, come on, you're smarter than that, Furiosa. But I think it's one of those things where it's supposed to be an emotional moment.
It is.
Is that an issue in writing? I think that sometimes as a writer, I try to avoid purely emotional beats because they don't always work. Sometimes they work for the writer, but they don't work for the audience because it just causes the audience to do what we've done and pause, and it takes us out of the moment instead of putting us in. If you're going to do an emotional moment, you have to make sure that there's some logic or sense within the story. I guess that you could argue that maybe Furiosa was trying to be good to the people, but at the same time...
She has to start a whole civilization all over again. She has to figure out a way so that everybody can start farming, so that everybody can get water, so that everybody can grow their own food. We think this is sort of a fairy tale ending, and it is. And like most fairy tale endings leave out the horrible stuff that happens after the fairy tale ending. They leave out the divorce of Cinderella and the prince, who realize, oh, we really don't like each other and we really hate each other, and our marriage is a complete flop. Or as Stephen Sondheim has in Into the Woods, you kill the giant, but now Mrs. Giant has climbed down the beanstalk and wants revenge. So we have this fairy tale ending without really thinking through, well, what does it mean now? Furioso has taken over, but there's still not enough food to go around. Water is still a finite source.
Well, that's the problem with a lot of revolutions. Yeah, you solve one problem, but there's now a whole host of problems that you're going to need to think through, and perhaps you should have considered how you were going to deal with it before you got to that point. That doesn't mean you shouldn't act, but it also means that you need to be smart about how you proceed. Wasting a good amount of your resources is not a smart action. Although it may win you the temporary love of the people, but those same people are going to turn on you when in a few weeks there's no more water because you guys all lapped it up.
Or you realize that it takes a lot of food to feed these people. And how are you feeding them? Of course, that's one of the things with sci-fi, and especially with apocalyptic movies. If you start thinking about them too closely, because the first question is, they had gas wars, they had water wars, yet they seem to have an infinite amount of gas to power their vehicles. Mad Max seems to have an infinite amount of gas to power his motorcycle. He seems to be able to get on well without any to no water. There's very little game to kill, to eat. These apocalyptic films are kind of fun as long as you don't think about them too deeply and realize that often they really don't make a lot of sense.
That's why the best use of resources as an obstacle in science fiction, well, there's two. And that's the reimagined Battlestar Galactica, the Ron Moore, David Icke TV series, and then Frank Herbert's Dune, because that's all about finite resources.
Right. It's a fight over who controls these resources. Here, even though water and gasoline are a finite source, there seems to be plenty of it around to keep this many people alive.
Yep.
But that's probably being a bit too pedantic. Are you a George Miller fan?
I've appreciated without loving a lot of his work. This and the two Babe movies are films that I absolutely love.
Well, yes, he produced the first Babe movie, right? And then he directed the second one.
Yeah. But the first one, even the director at the time said that was George's baby and I couldn't have done it without him. But you can look at that movie and just tell that George Miller had a couple of things to say about the visuals.
Yes. When I see the list of his films, I think of him as a solid craftsman. My favorite film of his is still The Road Warrior. That was the first one I ever saw, of course. It was very different. It was very eccentric, idiosyncratic, very quirky. It was the sort of thing we were looking for at the time when it came to independent film, something that was very much not Hollywood and was rather campy and kitschy at times, a lot of fun. I enjoyed the other Mad Max films. I didn't like them as much as The Road Warrior, I guess because I thought they were getting a bit more conventional, but still were very interesting. And then others of his films, in many ways, totally, of course, depended on the screenplay. The Witches of Eastwick has some marvelous visual moments, but the screenplay and the story isn't as good as the book.
Yeah, by far.
I love the first Babe movie. The second Babe movie didn't do a lot for me, but I thought the first Babe movie was quite incredible. That was one of the best films of the year.
Oh, I love both of them. I don't agree with the late Gene Siskel, who, if I remember right, named Babe Pig in the City as his final top film of the year.
Mm-hmm.
I did think it was quite good. And again, that's a film where that hotel where there's all the animals and that city that the hotel is in, that's another one where you get this entire world that's largely done visually. I can agree that Miller is a craftsman. Do I think he's an artist? I think he is an artist, but I think to be such a great artist, you have to have a bit of a craftsman about you, and there's nothing wrong with being a craftsman.
Right. I think he's a very solid movie maker. He's a very solid director. I'm not quite convinced he's any more than that myself. One thing you might want to say, though, about Mad Max Fury Road is that, yes, it's a brilliant film. Technically, it's brilliantly directed. I will not take away anything from that. But at the same time, one might want to say that the real hero of the movie, the person who really made the movie what it is Margaret Sixel, who was the editor.
Oh, absolutely.
She was Miller's wife. She asked him, "Why do you want me to edit this film? I've never done an action film before." And he said, "That's exactly why I want you to do it, because I don't want it to look like an action film that everybody else has done before." She had 470 hours of footage to edit, which I understand watching that alone took 3 months.
Good God. Yeah. I knew he'd shot hundreds of hours of footage, but Lord, just hearing the numbers.
Right. And also, they did some interesting things with either slowing or speeding up I'm not sure what you would call it.
There's some interesting zooms that are probably just frame rate increases.
That's it.
Works especially towards the beginning when he's trying to escape from the Citadel, but they capture him, then the credits start up.
Yes, even during the chase scenes, you can sometimes see the frame rate increase, and then at other times, it's back to normal.
It's a marvelously constructed and delivered film. I'll say this, not to spoil much. I vastly prefer it to the other film on this double bill.
With that, here's some more information about the movie. It cost $150 million to $185 million to make, and it made $375.2 million at the box office. It was a box office disappointment. It made a profit, but it did not make enough of a profit, so it was considered a disappointment. But according to Forbes, one of the reasons the film was less successful than everybody hoped for was its canceled release in China. If it had opened there, they had predicted that it would have passed $400 million in profit. But I remember at the time, there were people who were frustrated because they thought it should have done better. And people were actually trying to figure out why. It seemed to have everything Why didn't it do better?
Mm-hmm.
It did receive 10 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture, Best Director, Cinematography, and Special Effects. And it won the most awards of any film at the ceremony, with 6 for costume design, production design, makeup and hairstyling, film editing, and sound mixing. It broke the record for the most wins for an Australian film, which was previously held by The Piano, which won 3 Oscars. With that, let's get to my selection. That is A Boy and His Dog. First, some information about the film. The film was released in 1975. It was written and directed by L.Q. Jones, adapted from the novella by Harlan Ellison. It stars Don Johnson, Tim McIntyre, Susan Benton, Jason Robards, Alvy Moore, Helene Winston, Hal Baylor, and Tiger. The basic premise revolves around Vic, a teenager trying to survive in a post-apocalyptic American Southwest following World War IV. His only companion is his dog Blood, with whom Vic can communicate telepathically. While Vic makes sure Blood gets fed, Blood has a highly developed sense of smell that can not only smell out danger, he can also smell out women, whose only purpose in this future is basically to be raped by men. But Vic meets an unusual woman who lures him into an underground city modeled on a 1950s and earlier Topeka, Kansas, where he is to be used to impregnate the local female population. At first elated, Vic discovers that it's not what he thinks. So what do you think of the pairing of the two films?
Definitely get the pairing, but I'm going to be honest, I've never thought that this was one of Ellison's better works. The copy that I was able to find was the one that Amazon Prime had. And I'm serious, I don't know what the hell's going on with Amazon Prime these days, but it looks like a lot of their more obscure films that they have, and I'm thankful that they have them. A lot of them look like off-air broadcasts that have been on someone's VHS sitting in their basement for 30 years. The picture quality was not very good. The sound was a little off, so it was hard for me at times to fully take in the film. There was some good stuff there. There were also sequences that I thought went on a really long time, like when he's sniffing out the girl that ends up being the one that takes him to the underground civilization and the cult. That whole thing with that encampment, the films, I think it only lasts about 10 or 12 minutes, but it seemed to go on for a half hour. I much more enjoyed the first 10 or 15 minutes of the film where they were wandering around looking for a woman, even though you got the idea that this guy is up to pretty much no good. I mean, he's an amoral fellow, but the film doesn't really, rightfully so in this case, make a judgment about it, because this is an examination of what would happen under these circumstances. There's just a lot about this movie and its presentation. On the one hand, you could say it's brilliant, and on the other hand, it just rubbed me the wrong way.
I think, as you said, you just recently saw the film, right?
Yep, I had just recently seen it. Now, like I said, I had read the novella, ages ago. And I remember thinking it was good, but not great. And that's literally all I remembered.
I'm not sure what to say about the quality of the film you saw, because I also saw the Amazon Prime copy. I rented it a few days ago. My copy was excellent. It looked almost exactly like it did when I saw it on the screen. I first saw it in college, and perhaps one of the reasons why I have a fonder memory, or perhaps like it more than you do, is this was the time when I was especially trying to break away from studio films and what was considered the best at the time, which were these formulaic, very predictable, big budgeted type of studio film. I was in college, and every weekend, every organization would rent some place and show some film. This was the big thing to do on the weekend. It would be to raise money for whatever organization or whatever department of the college showing it. These were often very counterculture, often something that went well with pharmaceuticals. I saw things like Queen of Hearts, The Producers, The Devils, Dark Star, Blitzomania, and A Boy and His Dog was one of them. Even though I am not about to say that it is a great movie by any stroke of the imagination, I'm even wondering if I can really say that it is a good movie, but it was a fascinating one because it was so different.
Yeah,
It
I'm
was
not going to say it's a bad movie,
right.
but I don't want to say that it's a good movie.
It
Uh,
is what is called a cult favorite movie, and oftentimes, not always, but sometimes why a reason a movie becomes a cult favorite is not because it's good or bad. It's often because it actually is bad. But there's
yeah.
something just quite fascinating and interesting and different and very counterculture about it that makes it much more interesting often than the more popular or artistically accepted films. Did you have any favorite scenes? You said you liked the opening. Were there any other?
As sick as the ending was, I do like the ending. The dog does get a shatteringly sick end line with, she just had bad taste.
Right. Well, there's a difference between having bad taste and tasting bad. But
Oh, I also did like where Vic, Don Johnson's character, stole the food from the slaver. The slaver basically just said, let him have it. He earned it.
right. Yeah, he's better than you guys are. Speaking of the last line, the ending is perhaps the most controversial aspect of the movie for those who have seen it. And I'm not exactly quite convinced. L.Q. Jones finally wrote the screenplay, apparently because Harlan Ellison just had writer's block and couldn't figure out how to write it. Harlan Ellison was generally pleased with the film, but he particularly objected to the film's final line, which didn't come from his original short story. As you said, the line is Blood, the dog, saying, well, I'd say she certainly had marvelous judgment, Albert, if not particularly good taste. And Ellison referred to it as moronic, hateful, chauvinistic last line, which I despise. Now, in the novel, what the last paragraph is, it's told, I guess, from Vic's point of view, first person. We had to move slow because Blood was still limping. It took a long time before I stopped hearing her calling me in my head, asking me, do you know what love is? Sure, I know. A boy loves his dog. What doesn't really convince me is Ellison thinking that the line in the movie is chauvinistic. I mean, I want to say, yes, it is chauvinistic. Yes, it is misogynistic, but so is the whole movie.
And so are the two characters. And if Ellison wrote the characters that way in the novella, which he basically did, and the film was fairly accurate to the characters, then Ellison is suddenly judging his own characters rather than letting them be complex figures that you can make your own judgments about. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily great.
Yes, for me, Ellison here is the pot calling the kettle black, because I can't find any real difference in the line that L.Q. Jones came in that it's any less chauvinistic or misogynistic than the movie is as a whole.
Right.
But apparently a lot of people agree with Ellison. I just can't quite see difference myself, so I never quite understood that. But the film was very different for its time. It was very much counterculture. It had morals and attitude that was quite at odds at a time when people's morals and attitudes were changing. This was the time of the Vietnam War, the time of protests in the street, of the civil rights movement. This was the time, ironically, of the women's rights movement, which was not taken seriously in movies at the time. In fact, the women in movies at this time were treated pretty horribly. For a time when art was supposed to show this great change or reflect this great change in society, a couple of areas where it wasn't was in the women's movement and the gay rights movement. So though we have this movie that is counterculture, that when they go below into the city of Topeka, Kansas, is making fun of everything that is essentially American, it's also very misogynistic. In this future, women have no use but to be procreators, and below the surface, they get impregnated and unfortunately usually have female children, which is one of the big problems. On the surface, they're just raped. That's their only purpose. The audience, instead of reacting in horror to that at the time, actually found it kind of, I wouldn't say funny, but it was very black comedy, and they went along with it. They didn't object to this. But that was the 1970s, progressive in some ways, but very regressive in others. Mm-hmm. But what I did like about it at the time, and I'm not saying this is a great movie, is that it was just so different. It was something you just didn't see going to the movie theaters.
That's something that people say, well, everything needs to be art or everything needs to be just entertainment. And I disagree. I mean, there's a place for art, there's a place for entertainment. There's no reason they can't intersect. If everything was great or everything was bad, it would be a quite boring world.
This was a film that at first the studios did try to make, but L.Q. Jones refused. He had bought the rights from Harlan Ellison and refused to sell them or asked them for such a ridiculously high amount of money plus 90% of the profits that they said no, because I think he knew what the studios would do with it. He made it himself, and this was an independent film at a time when there weren't necessarily a lot of independent films being made. And we get this quirky, weird, odd, strange, apocalyptic film that is greatly imperfect. I do like the sets, the technical aspect of it from that perspective. I like the scenes in the YMCA where they go underground, where he meets the woman and he actually has an encounter with a woman that is romantic instead of violent, and he doesn't understand it and he doesn't know what to do about it. And I like especially the opening scenes when he gets to the Topeka, Kansas, with the high school marching band going through this park, everybody dressed in these old-fashioned clothes with this weird makeup in which the old people had very, very pronounced white makeup with red cheekbones, black outlines. And the young people in Rebellion had very light makeup. So even in this Topeka, Kansas, there were these little signs of rebellion.
Well, it's also interesting that you had a color difference in Topeka when, if memory serves, Topeka was, of course, in real life, the site of a horrible racial incident in, I believe, the 30s.
I mean, it is interesting to note there are no black people in this movie.
Yeah.
There are no black people really in Mad Max Fury Road either. It's in Australia, but there don't seem to be any Aboriginals in the movie. So both of these have these apocalyptic visions in which the white race is the only one that has really survived.
Yeah, I think there's one or two people that you can't tell if they're just bedraggled or they're supposed to be Aboriginal when you see them going for the water.
Right, in Mad Max Fury Road.
But otherwise, that is something to think about. I'm not sure how purposeful that is. Intentional or not, it definitely makes a statement.
It was probably one of these things where they just didn't think about it. And especially in the 1970s, you simply didn't think about it. You just generally cast all white and never realized that there was something a little odd. I would believe that in the underground in Topeka, Kansas, you would not have any black people there. They would not allow black people in that city, in that civilization. But above, it's every man for himself. It's dog and dog. So there's no reason why there wouldn't be black people above.
Yeah.
A Boy and His Dog has had a huge influence. Ellison has said, and this is a quote, "This film, A Boy and His Dog, was 20 years ahead of its time. The fact that it's been ripped off so many times to do this kind of dystopian future, both in novels and film, shows that the film was a landmark. I had George Miller call me from Australia to tell me The Road Warrior was ripped off. And he used the phrase ripped off from A Boy and His Dog. And then he wanted to thank me. But Road Warrior is a great movie. Many of the people who have done films like A Boy and His Dog have done homages whether they care to admit it or not. And I'm down with that. It's part of being a great silver-maned icon of the 20th century culture. So in many ways, we, to some degree, have A Boy and His Dog to thank even for Mad Max Fury Road, since that grew out of The Road Warrior, which grew out of A Boy and His Dog. And I think A Boy and His Dog was a very different kind of apocalyptic film. It was much more of a downer than many other apocalyptic films. Much more cynical, much more humorous, a black comedy, much more tongue-in-cheek. What do you think is the appeal of apocalyptic films? People keep making them.
Well, I don't think it's any one thing, but I think it's a few things. One thing is, and I'm going to be honest, one thing is I think people love to have these blank canvases to create these funky tableaus. What better than to imagine a world where everything's gone to hell? You can take that which is familiar, give it a really twisted bend. That makes it relatable, and that's another thing. These are relatable because you can look around and you can see issues like, well, when the first Mad Max was being made, And there were issues with gasoline, which of course still have issues with that sort of a natural resource. And then Fury Road, where it's about water, so it's still about natural resources. In the end, I think that it appeals to something about, I don't want to say that there's something nihilistic in human beings. They just believe that everything is going to go bad. But I want to say that people like to watch something and maybe think, yeah, it could turn out like that, but I don't want it to. And I think a lot of people, because I know I've had friends that have watched some of these movies and gone, well, in that movie, this, and this happened. So what if we all work to do this, and this to avoid that? And I think that in a way, these films serve as inspiration to avoid the mistakes that the films are speaking about.
I think you make a lot of good points there. I especially like the idea of this is sort of a blank canvas. And because it is, you can make comments, and whether satiric or not, about all sorts of issues that exist today. Someone also once said, and I don't remember who, it's probably actually many people, one of the reasons why sci-fi is so popular, by definition, sci-fi says there is a future. So no matter how bad the world is in a sci-fi novel, the world still exists. People still exist. There is a future. There is hope. By definition, no matter how dark the future is, it is by definition a hopeful look at mankind because we survived and we will continue to survive. The film had the tagline as an R-rated, rather kinky tale of survival. And I believe Roger Ebert said something like this. I'm probably going to heavily paraphrase, that Harlan Ellison was one of the first sci-fi writers who said that bodily functions, here sex, were as important or more important in writing about sci-fi than in traditional sci-fi subjects of aliens and progress. Yeah. It's not really about a traditional sci-fi subject. And I would suppose that a lot of people would then claim it's probably not by definition sci-fi. But the emphasis is more on sex in the future.
Absolutely.
With that, here's some more information about the film. It cost $400,000 to make. It ran regularly for 7 years at repertory houses. I believe L.Q. Jones did his own distributing until it had a general release in 1982. So the box office by then was $6 million, plus $900,000 from recent test reruns nationwide. L.Q. Jones, his own company, produced the film. That's why he directed it. He only directed 2 other things. That's all that's on his IMDb list. So it did eventually, after 7 years, make a profit of almost $7 million. Tim McIntyre, a veteran voice actor, is the voice of Blood, the dog. He also did most of the music for the film. He sang the main title theme at the very end. He also did the music for such movies as Jeremiah Johnson. Alvy Moore, who was one of the 3 on the committee in the underground Topeka, Kansas scenes, is probably perhaps better known for playing Hank Kimball on The Makers. L.Q. Jones played the actor in the porno film. Tiger, the dog that played Blood, if he looks familiar, it's because he was in a few episodes of The Brady Bunch. The film was not commercially successful at the time of its release, but it has developed a cult following over the years. Apparently, it inspired the video game series Fallout on many levels, from underground communities of survivors to glowing mutants. And that's according to Jesse Heinig, who developed the game. It also got terrible reviews when it opened. It was systematically panned by everybody, though I think some reviewers like Roger Ebert said that in many ways, and this is my own way of facing it, it did sort of work on its own terms. With that, let's start closing out, and I asked you to choose a film or 2 to go with your choice that might interest our audience.
The 2 films that I came up with, because I